Hello everyone, welcome to another video lecture, one shot video of the chapter French Revolution. Now this chapter French Revolution is from your class 9th history portion. I am Ashwin Joglekar from Resonance PCCP division. So let us quickly begin and start with the one shot video on the French Revolution. Now here on the screen probably you can see the image of the storming of Bastille that happened on 14th of July 1789 in or during the process of the revolution in France. Alright. The French Revolution, that is in 1789, in the wake of early morning, the city of Paris was in a state of alarm. Rumours spread that the king would open fire upon the citizens, and people started gathering and started breaking a number of government buildings in search of arms, because they wanted to make sure that they are prepared once the army comes in, and probably they will also have something to fight back with. The commander of the Bastille was killed in the armed fight and the prisoners were released. People hated the Bastille as it represented or stood for the despotic power of the king or the monarch. People protested against the high price of bread. A new chain of events began which led to the execution of later on the king of France, who was Louis XVI. Now this is the first story or the first part which we see in the NCERT, that is the beginning of the chapter. Alright. Now, who was Louis XVI of France? Louis XVI, he was the king of France. Louis XVI was the last Bourbon king of France, who was executed later on in 1793 for treason. In 1770, he married Austrian princess Marie Antoinette, the daughter of Maria Theresa and Holy Roman Emperor Francis I. After a slew of governing missteps, Louis XVI brought the French Revolution crashing down upon himself. Louis was guillotined and followed by Marie Antoinette 9 months later. Now, as soon as the Louis XVI became the king of or the ruler of France in 1774, what he found was an empty treasury. That is, the treasury had become empty. He ascended the throne of France and found that the treasury was empty. Now, the reasons why this empty treasury, reasons can be, the first one was war, that is the prolonged war with Britain, that is the 7 years war. Later on, they were also helping the 13 American colonies against the British. So, it led to the drain of wealth. Then secondly, to maintain the immense palace at Versailles, Palace of Versailles, उसको maintain करने के लिए जो खर्चा था, वो भी एक reason बना. और प्लस उनकी खुद की lavish lifestyle जो थी राजाओं की, तो ये सब कुछ reason बन गए lavish lifestyle. They all became the reason why the treasury was empty. अब हमें ये पता चल गया कि ओके, राजा लुई 16 राजा बन गया, उसने देखा कि ट्रेजरी एम्प्टी है, ये सब रीजंस हो गए उसके. नाउ व्हाट नेक्स्ट? टू इंक्रीज द ट्रेजरी ही हैड टू इंक्रीज द टैक्सेस. नाउ इसी से कनेक्टेड नेक्स्ट पॉइंट आता है आपका, दैट इज हु एक्चुअली देन पेड टैक्सेस इन फ्रांस एट दैट टाइम. ओके, सो द पीपल वर क्लास्ड इनटू, दैट इज द सोसाइटी एट दैट टाइम इन फ्रांस वाज डिवाइडेड इनटू 3 estates. फर्स्ट, second and third estate. The first estate people were from the clergy, that is the people who were priests. Second estate were the nobles or the aristocrats, and the third was the rest of the people. The complete burden of taxes was on the third estate. Alright, तो ये तो estates के बारे में हुआ. Next है, Louis XVI was born again in the Palace of Versailles. Named Louis Augustus de France, he was given the title of Duc de Berry, signifying his junior status in the French court. Louis XVI was the third son of Louis, Dauphin of France, and grandson of Louis XV of France. His mother, Mary Joseph of Saxony, was the daughter of Frederick Augustus II of Saxony, also the king of Poland. Louis XV's great-great-grandfather was Louis XIV of France, also known as the Sun King. So, this is some brief history about them. Now, French society during the late 18th century, that is what we discussed just previously. Louis XVI in 1774 ascended the throne of France. First point, he was 20 years old then, married to again Austrian Princess Marie Antoinette. Financially, France was drained because of the war. France under Louis XVI helped the 13 American colonies to gain their independence from Britain. The war added more than billion livre. Livre was the currency which was there at that time, which was used in France. Then it became total 2 billion livres. Lenders also they wanted starting charging money, that is 10% interest on loans. Now taxes had to be increased to meet regular expenses such as the cost of maintaining an army, the court, running of government offices or universities. The country of France was divided into 3 estates in the 18th century. 3 estates, that is the first estate, second estate and the third estate. The feudal system was part of the society estates which dated back to the Middle Ages. 90% of the population was dominated by peasants, but only a small number of them owned the land they cultivated. Rest were under these landlords or the nobles. 60% was owned by nobles, the church and the other richer members of the third estate. The clergy and the nobility members, that is of the first 2 estates, enjoyed certain privileges by birth. So they were given certain privileges by birth and they were also exempted from paying taxes, that is they did not pay taxes, exempted from paying any taxes and enjoyed feudal privileges, that is they even collected taxes. The church, that is the church, extracted a share of taxes called the teeths from the peasants. All members of the third estate had to pay taxes to the state, which included a direct tax called the taille. So the tax which was collected by the state was known as taille. So sometimes if the question comes, probably there is a small trick through which you can remember this ta. Okay. So the tax which was collected by the state was taille, and a number of other indirect taxes which were also levied on articles of everyday consumption like salt or tobacco. Now the term old regime is basically referred to the institutions of France before 1789. For them, whatever institutions were there in France, for that we refer or we call them as old regime. Alright, okay. Now this again chart showing first estate, that is your clergy, second estate is the nobility, and the third estate consisted all of the rest of the population. Now third estate included your big business people, merchants, court officials and lawyers, as well as the poorer sections of the society. Now the struggle to survive. See, between 1700s and we can say 1789, the population of France was rising steadily. Almost 28 million people increased, population increasing or increase, which led demand of food was also increasing, right? As the population was increasing, the demand of food was also increasing, but the demand was not, the supply was not able to match up with the growing demand. So therefore, there was always the rise in prices. Now the poor people were not able to afford it. So that is what led to these crisis situation. Increase in population led to rapid increase for food grains. Production of grains could not keep pace with the demand, due to which the price of bread used to increase, rose rapidly. Alright. Now due to low wages paid to the labourers, the gap between the rich and the poor was widening or widened. Things became worse whenever drought or hail again destroyed the crops or reduced the harvest. Now if you already have some harvest, but again even if that is also destroyed, so that will again make it kind of an acute shortage of food grains, and which used to happen regularly in France. So this situation actually was also known as subsistence crisis. Now this word probably you are familiar with, that is in subsistence crisis, the basic means of your survival or livelihood are endangered. So growing middle class envisages an end to privileges. Now the growing middle class, now see you had probably the rich people and the poor people. Now slowly people who had moved to cities or who had started working as merchants or court lawyers or other professions who had taken up, now they were slowly becoming wealthy, and they also started or were getting educated. That is, they were reading new materials which was being published. So therefore, they envisioned a society now where the privileges which were granted to the first or the second estate could be abolished, and people would be given merit on the basis of the kind of work they are doing in the society. Okay. So growing middle classes envisages an end to privileges. Peasants used to participate in revolts against taxes and food scarcity. Group of the third estate had become prosperous and had access to education and new ideas. A group, not all of them. In the 18th century, new social groups emerged. That is, earlier it was only rich and poor, but now new social groups emerged, which we now refer as middle classes, termed the middle class, who earned their wealth through expanding overseas trade and by manufacturing woolen and silk textiles that were either exported or brought by the rich members of the or richer members of the society. The third estate also included professions such as lawyers or administrative officials. So they also became wealthy and they were again educated. A person's social position was dependent on their merit. All of these were educated and believed that no group in society should be privileged by the birth. Rather, a person's social position must depend on his merit, that is, the kind of work he is able to do. A new form of government was proposed by Rousseau based on social contract, that is the name of his book also. We will also be looking at the three thinkers who were there, John Locke, Rousseau and Montesquieu, between people and their representatives. That is, there is a social contract between the people and the people who are governing them, leaders. Similarly, Montesquieu again proposed a division of power within the government, the spirit of the laws, that is was his book, and the book by John Locke was the two treatises of government. So between the legislative, that is the government, or the power should be divided between, not all power should rest with the king or only one person. It should be divided between legislature, executive and judiciary. That is the three organs of the government. And in USA, it was being used also. Government was put into force. Louis XVI planned to impose further taxes because to meet the expenses which was again growing. So that is what led to the revolution. The outbreak of the revolution. In France, the monarch didn't have the power to impose taxes, that is, he had to call a meeting of the Estates General. Now here one more point will be worth mentioning, that you will see from monarchy it becomes constitutional monarchy, and from constitutional monarchy it will become a republic. I am not talking about the later part, that is the directory when it comes, and then later on dictatorship when Napoleon took over power. And apart from this, one more thing you can see here, that is, even in terms of assemblies, Estates General will be later on renamed as National Assembly, and later on it became conventional. Okay. So in France, the monarch did not have the power to impose taxes. He had to call a meeting of the Estates General, that is a political body which all the three estates sent their representatives to pass proposals for new taxes. Now this was just a formality, actually it was all pre-decided. Louis XVI on 5th May 1789 called an assembly to pass proposal for new taxes. Representatives from the first and the second estates were present, and the third estate was represented by its prosperous section and educated members. According to the principle, each estate had one vote. Now, what was the principle was, probably I will just show you. See, the first estate, the complete estate, that is the 300 members who were there, will have one vote, alright. Similarly, the second estate again sent 300 members and it also had one vote. And finally, the third estate had 600 members, but even they had complete one vote. So each estate as a whole or a body had one vote. Now, according to the book of Rousseau, that is the social contract, now the people of the third estate proposed an idea that now it should be one person, one vote, which the king refused. And later on, as a protest, these people just walked out, that is the members of the third estate walked out in protest, and later on they gathered into the tennis court and took the tennis court oath. Okay. The representatives from the third estate demanded that is each member would have one vote, and this was one of the democratic principles put forward by philosophers like Rousseau in his book the social contract. When the king rejected this proposal, members of the third estate just walked out of the assembly in protest. The demand was rejected, so members of the third estate walked out, and on 20th June they met, or they assembled in the hall of an indoor tennis court in the grounds of Versailles, and there they took the tennis court oath. They swore not to disperse till a constitution drafted for France that would limit the powers of the monarch or the king. They were led by Mirabeau, and Mirabeau was from the noble family or the second estate, and Abbassius belonged to the clergy of the groups, that is, was originally a priest, and he also wrote an influential pamphlet called the What is the Third Estate? Alright. Due to the severe winter and bread prices rose and people had to spend hours in long queues. Now on 14th of July, the agitated crowd stormed and destroyed the Bastille. Rumours spread that the lords of the manor hired bands of brigands. Now this was also spreading in the countryside. Now there also the rumours were spread that the lords of the manor, the houses, had called in brigands, that is goons, to come and destroy the ripe crops. Now even these farmers in the countryside stood up in protest with whatever they had. In fear, peasants started looting hoarded grains and burned down the houses or documents containing records of manorial, the dues which they had to pay. Nobles fled from their homes in fear, and finally Louis XVI accorded, that is, he gave his recognition to the National Assembly and accepted the principle that his powers would from now on be checked by a constitution. The assembly passed a decree abolishing the feudal system of obligation and taxes, which was abolished on 4th of August 1789. So starting from May, then June, July and August. So this is what happened probably in the year 1789 in these months. That is, the revolution took place, and finally National Assembly in 4th of August the king recognized it, the body National Assembly. Now teats, the taxes which were collected by the church, were also abolished, and lands owned by the church were confiscated, that is, taken over. And as a result, the government acquired assets which were worth 2 billion livres, and thus the debt which was due was also being paid. Okay. Now France becomes a constitutional monarchy. In 1791, the National Assembly completed the draft of the constitution, and its main objective was to limit the powers of the monarch. These powers were now separated and assigned to different institutions like the legislature, the executive and the judiciary, that is, the division of powers between the organs of the government, and thus France became a constitutional monarchy in 1791. Citizens voted a group of electors. Now again, this was not a complete transformation because here again people were divided into active and passive citizens. Now active are the people who had the right to vote. Now even right to vote was given to only certain sections of the population, that is, only men could vote, and that too above the age of 25 years and those who paid taxes. Rest all were classified as passive citizens. Women, men who were below the age of 25 and who did not pay taxes were all came under this passive citizens. So citizens, they voted for a group of electors who in turn choose the assembly. But unfortunately, not every citizen had the right to vote. Men above 25 years of age who paid taxes equal to at least 3 days of a labourer wage were entitled to vote. The constitution began with a declaration of the rights of man and citizen. Rights such as right to life, freedom of speech, freedom of opinion, equality before the law were all established as natural and inalienable rights. Now these are natural as well as inalienable rights which cannot be taken away from the persons, and they have it right from the birth. Now in today's scenario of present world, what rights we see are all because of the revolution probably which happened in France here. That is, they belong to each human being by birth and could not be taken away. Now this is how it is done. That is, most of the people were classified as passive citizens, no voting rights, and women, children and youth below 25 active citizens. Then they voted for electors some 50,000 people, and then they finally selected from that 745 members. So in reality, if we will see, the National Assembly consisted of the most prosperous sections of the third estate. Alright, that is, the poor sections did not have any say. So these were left out, and that is why later on another takeover of power will happen here in France. Alright, king again had the veto power, and this is how it was done. Now France abolished monarchy and becomes a republic later on. Then April of 1792, the National Assembly voted for a war against Prussia and Austria. Now what happened was, see, the reason behind this was Louis XVI was in secret negotiations with the king of Austria and Prussia. Why? Because the king wanted to suppress what the revolution had done in France and these revolutionaries, so he needed help. Even the king of Prussia and Austria were also ready to help him, because they did not want an experiment which has taken in France or took place in France would spread to their regions as well. So therefore they wanted to crush this experiment. But National Assembly got the news that this kind of secret negotiations are going on between Louis XVI of France and the king of Austria and Prussia. So therefore National Assembly declared war on Prussia and Austria. Now people from all parts of France came and wanted to take part in this war, because they saw this as a war of a common man versus the monarchy. Now Marseillaise became the national anthem of France during this time, and while men were away fighting at the war, women took care of their families. Large sections of the population demanded that the revolution had to be carried further, as Constitution of 1791 gave political rights only to the richer sections of the society. That is, only the prosperous sections were benefited from this. Political clubs were formed, and among them the Club of Jacobin, because it was formed as in Paris near Saint Jacob. So became the most outspoken or successful club. Members of the Jacobin Club included small shopkeepers and artisans such as shoemakers, pastry cooks, watchmakers, printers, as well as servants and daily wage workers. Jacobin members started wearing long striped trousers which were similar to those which were worn by dock workers, and these Jacobins were called the sans-culottes, literally meaning those without the knee breeches. And the leader was Maximilien Robespierre. On August 10th, 1792, Jacobins stormed the palace of Tuileries and held the king hostage as well as his family for several hours. Elections were held, and all men of 21 years of and above of age were given the right to vote, even if they had or they did not have any property. Monarchy was abolished on 21st September 1792, and France thus became a republic and declared a republic. Louis XVI was sentenced to death by a court on the charge of treason. Treason, that is अपने देश से ही गद्दारी करना. That is, he conspired with the king of Austria and Prussia. So therefore he was charged for treason and sentenced to death. Now thus started the reign of terror. The period from 1793 to 1794 is referred to as the reign of terror. People whom Robespierre saw enemies of the republic, Maximilien Robespierre was the leader of the Jacobins, were arrested, imprisoned, and then tried by a revolutionary tribunal, and if found guilty, they were guillotined. That is, if they were declared guilty by the court, then they were guillotined. That is, they were publicly executed. The guillotine is a device consisting of two poles and a blade with which a person is beheaded, named after Dr. Guillotine, who invented it. Laws were issued to place maximum ceiling on wages and prices, so that everything could be controlled, or even meat and bread were rationed. That is, only a fixed amount of meat and bread you could purchase. Expensive white flour was forbidden to use. Everyone would use the equality flour. Equality was practiced through forms of speech as well, the kind of the forms of address. Citoyen, that is citizen, everyone, and address, sorry. All French men and women now were addressed as citoyen and citoyenne, that is citizen. In July 1794, finally, Robespierre himself was being convicted by a court, arrested, and later on guillotine. Next day sent to the guillotine, because the people who were close to him only now started fearing him. Now the Directory will come and rule the France. A Directory rules France. Fall of the Jacobin government allowed again the wealthier middle class to take or seize power. According to the new constitution, what they did was the non-propertied sections of the society denied voting. Again, though the people who did not have any property were denied voting rights. It provided for 2 elected legislative councils, which would again then elect an executive made of 5 members. Sorry, that is, the government appointed a Directory consisting of executives made up of 5 members. Now the problem was the executives and these legislative councils were always in a constant clash. So therefore, what these legislative council member did, they asked them or they again dismissed them, that is, the members of the executives were dismissed by the legislative councils, again new members were appointed, again those clashes happened. So therefore, there was no stability among the Directory, and that is why it led for Napoleon to rise. That is, political instability paved the way for military dictator Napoleon Bonaparte to rise. Now, next topic is, did women have a revolution? Women were active participants from the beginning, which brought important changes in the country, France. Women again from the third estate had to work for a living sorry, and they didn't have access to education or job training as well. Daughters of the nobles of the third estate were allowed to study or at a convent where they could again educate themselves. Working women also had to care for their families. So now it was a dual burden on women in most of the societies. That is how we see that they had to work also, and then they had to care for their families also. Compared to men, their wages were lower. Women also started their political clubs and newspapers. Olympe de Gouges was one of the famous women revolutionaries during this period, who again was being guillotined during the Reign of Terror. The Society of Revolutionary and Republican Women was one of the most famous women's organizations or clubs at that time. They again demanded equal political rights as men, because the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Now they demanded that there should also be a Declaration of the Rights of Women and Citizen. The right to vote again to women and to hold political offices also. The revolutionary government introduced laws to improve the life of women. Schooling became compulsory for women. Divorce again was made legal, and they could run small businesses. But during the Reign of Terror, the government banned all these political clubs which were run by women, closed women's clubs and banning their political activities. After much struggle, women in France in 1946 somewhere won the right to vote. That is much later. Alright. Then about the abolition of slavery. Now from the there was a triangular slave trade which was being practiced from the ports of Nantes and Bordeaux in France. Sailors used to, that is merchants used to come to the African coast, and from there again pack ships with the slaves and take them to the Caribbean to work in plantations. That is how a triangular slave trade, that is from Europe, they came to Africa, and from here they traveled towards America, and that is how a triangular slave trade was happening. So Jacobin regime's most revolutionary social reform was the abolition of slavery in French colonies in 1794, but after 10 years again it was reintroduced by Napoleon. That is, in the 17th century, slavery trade began. Slaves were brought from local chieftains, branded and shackled, and were packed tightly into ships for the 3-month-long voyage across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. Slave labor met the growing demand in European markets for sugar, coffee and indigo, which were being produced in these plantations. Throughout the 18th century, there was little criticism of slavery in France, but in 1794, the convention legislated to free all the slaves under in French overseas possessions. Napoleon again reintroduced slavery after he came to power 10 years later, and in 1848 finally slavery was abolished in the French colonies. Next is the revolution and the everyday life. How everyday life was changed, that is, they at least people, the first thing was right to freedom of speech and expression. That is, France during 1789 saw changes in the lives of men, women as well as children. Abolition of censorship again was an important aspect. happened in the summer of 1789. Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen proclaimed freedom of speech and expression to be a natural right. Before that, the individuals never had any freedom of speech and expression as such. Freedom of press meant opposing views of events now could be published or expressed by different people. Plays, songs and festive processions attracted large number of people during these times. Conclusion. Now finally, Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself as the Emperor of France in 1804 and introduced a new or many laws such as the protection of private property and a uniform system of weights and measures provided by the decimal system. Napoleon was defeated later on in the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. The ideas of liberty, democratic rights were the most influential or important legacy of the French Revolution, which still continues today. Colonized peoples reworked on the idea of freedom to create a sovereign nation state years later. In India, Tipu Sultan and Raja Rammohn Roy were the two examples of individuals who were very influenced or responded to the ideas which are coming from this revolutionary France. Now this brings us to the end of the chapter. I hope you enjoyed the one shot video on French Revolution. Thank you so much.